Welcome, I'm Suzanne Phillips. Thanks for joining me again on Psych Live. Sometimes you have the opportunity to meet someone whose life and work is beyond what you can imagine. It exemplifies the extraordinary capacity to survive and to live a life that passes forward understanding, brilliant care, and extraordinary compassion. Today, you're going to hear from one of those people, Dr. Alfred Garwood, originally Dr. Alfred Garfinkel. Dr. Garwood was born in a Nazi ghetto, imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp as an infant with his parents, and later put on a train destined for Terezin concentration camp. He and his family were liberated by the Red Army. When they returned to Poland, they found that there were only two members of their family out of the 60 members who had survived. Alfred spent the rest of his childhood in Britain and grew up in the center of a community of Holocaust survivors. Over the years, he has worked as a general practitioner and a psychiatrist and has written extensively on the psychological implications of trauma relating to genocide. His book is entitled Holocaust Trauma and Psychic Deformation, Psychoanalytic Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. I want you to know that Dr. Garwood is the co-founder of the Survivors Center of Great Britain. He has also just recently received the Member of the British Empire Medal from Prince William for all the work he has done for so many years with Holocaust survivors. Dr. Alfred Garwood, it is my privilege to welcome you to Psych Up Live.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so you talk when you write in one of your papers, the title is A Journey from Pain to Violence and from Violence to Healing. Tell us how your life somehow reflects that title.
Well, I was conceived in a Nazi ghetto, and my mother's, during her pregnancy, her life was in danger. It was in real threat of not surviving, and if she didn't survive, nor would I. And then we went into the ghetto, and then from the ghetto to a concentration camp. And all of this dreadfulness somehow has helped me to be creative and make some good, healthy choices. And I'm surprised to say that I was honoured by the King in honouring me with the MBE, the Member of the British Empire Medal, and I received it only a month ago, just over a month ago, in Windsor Castle from Prince William, who is a remarkable young man, and he's 6 foot, more than 6 foot tall, and he's very genuine and authentic, and it was a pleasure to speak to. So I feel hugely honoured, and some of my efforts have been recognised.
Yes, yes, and that honor was well earned. And I love that your children, a number of your children, three of your five children, were there to witness that. That is great. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, we have people listening in who have experienced terrific events and like you have had to find a way to move from the unthinkable trauma to the miraculous parts of life and to finding a way to hold on and to hope. So, one of the things you write about, and let's just talk about it as a start, is what you call the traumatogenic triad. Alfred, tell us a little bit about that.
I should clarify that not only was I a general practitioner working for many years with people who would become terminally ill and get very afraid, but also ordinary families who had their difficulties, and often they had problems with their teenage children and they used to come for advice. Um, and I'm also a group analyst. So I was doing group therapy as well as psychiatry but I dealt with a lot of people who had psychiatric
Mhm.
illnesses as well. And being both a medical doctor as well as a mental health doctor, what I realized was that the fundamental experience of people who are traumatized are down to three basic traumatic experiences or forces. And one of them is the threat of dying. I call it annihilation anxiety. And we all fear death. In fact, our whole body system is made to watch out for the death of us the risk of us being killed.
Mm.
Second thing is helplessness. I think, in fact, in my experience, it's the most powerful and painful experience in life to
Mm.
be completely helpless. And the third thing is the loss of loved ones, because it's our loved ones and the memory of our experiences of being cared for and protected that we use throughout the whole of our life to deal with the pain and difficulties of life
Mm.
and the things that we might meet.
Mm. Now, one of the things that you was mentioning to me before our show was what children do, and you were very, very little one in the camps, what children do with memory. And you mentioned that your parents felt you had no memory of what had happened. And you didn't, in fact, have the ability to pull up memories. Tell us a little bit about when you realized you actually had a, an imprint of that horrific experience.
I think it was very understandable of my parents to want to believe that their child had not suffered the terrible things that they had
Right.
suffered.
Yes.
I wanted to believe that because I was a baby, that it went over my head that I didn't understand anything. Now, since then, we've understood something called attachment theory, which teachers use and child psychiatrists use and social workers use. And it's the basic relationship that loved ones have with each other, particularly children with their carers. And we understand those early years are the most important thing. So, uh, what happened was that my parents constantly told me that you're not a survivor, that you went over your head, you didn't know what was going on, you were just sort of a happy baby, and that was fair enough, and so therefore you didn't suffer. And we're in Britain every year. There's a Remembrance Sunday when all of the terrible sacrifices of life that went on in the First and Second World War are remembered, and they always used to show a film that the British Army took when they liberated Bergen-Belsen, and it is the most terrible film anyone's ever seen. It's much worse than anything that you've seen of Auschwitz, and I used to be able to see this, and I was not particularly disturbed or upset by it. And I used to think, well, that's true. Maybe I wasn't old enough to be affected by it. But when my late wife died, um, I'm sort of making a bit of a jump here. But anyway, I had a reason to ask my parents to come back to Belsen with me, 45 years after the anniversary, 1990. And my father and my parents, my mother and sister agreed. And we went back to the camp. And when we went into the museum, I looked at the photographs and I once again, I didn't have a reaction. And I thought, yeah, they're right. I don't feel any different from normal. The next day, woke up very early in the morning, determined to take some video of the camp and to record some things we'd spoken about. And that I got halfway to the camp and I suddenly felt terrible. I felt overwhelmed by feelings I couldn't describe. And I just couldn't drive. I had to pull over. And I was hugely relieved that at least I'd had some reaction.
Mm. Mm.
And then when I tried to drive this simple route, I kept getting lost. Anyway, I got into the camp and I got out of my car and I started walking in the path into the camp, and something overtook me. I started to feel so weak I could barely stand. My head dropped, and I was looking at the floor in a sort of an arc, as though I was looking for something. And it carried on for ages, and I couldn't understand what was going on. And I was very scared of people who walked past me who were walking quickly.
Mm-hmm.
What I realized was happening was I was having a body memory, an age appropriate memory for this period called infantile amnesia. And I was feeling what I had felt when I was a 2 year old, when I had severe rickets and could barely stand. I was starving and hungry and looking for food, and I was terrified of the various dangers because there were so many different dangers. You could die any moment without prediction in the
Mm-hmm.
camp. And that was a very, very important experience for me
Mm-hmm.
because I realized it affected me and I knew I was affected. And then when I looked at photographs, I felt that terrible feeling of fear and dreadfulness again. So that sort of where all the memories had gone in my mind, which was a kind of compartment tucked it away in the corner of the mind, had been opened up and it could never be closed again.
Mm. It's so powerful because you go on to become the co-founder of the Children's Survivors, and you now had a visceral memory of what that experience was like for children.
I tried to make a new life. Tried not to be a child of survivors. I tried not to be scared the way my parents were scared. They lived in peacetime as though the next Holocaust was about to happen
Right.
round the corner and they would always be ready.
Mm,
They wouldn't have to lose all their loved ones the way they had done in the Holocaust. And they would prepare us. They would say you have to be careful who you trust. You don't wash your dirty linen. If people are interested, you want to know why they're interested in you and not to trust people. This element of trust was always a big issue.
mm,
And they were kind of giving me the values, the survival values that they had learnt.
hmm.
Of course, I was in peacetime,
Yeah, yeah.
and it made me a misfit. And I struggled in all of aspects of life, in school, with society, with relationships. But fortunately, I was able to kind of bring myself up, so to speak, to choose the sort of values to think about things, uh, about why people did things, because I was very confused and I was sort of bullied at school. I was misunderstood and I was ridiculed. I was fortunate enough to marry a very good and a caring human being who, and I managed after 10 years of trying to get into medical school by changing my name, by sounding English to get
Mm,
over it. And there was an anti-Semitic uh, list, there was a quota because they
mm,
didn't want too many Jews in the medical school, believe it or not.
mhm, mm,
So I got into medical school, and then just before I qualified, my my wife showed the first signs of multiple sclerosis. Now, in those days, multiple sclerosis was like saying someone had cancer.
mhm,
Immediately thought, that's it, their life is over. She thought, these people think their life is paralysis, and they're going to have a miserable life, and they would get very depressed. So I didn't say anything to my wife. I decided to wait and see because there was a chance that she could have had only one attack. And, being, I suppose it was consistent with my upbringing as a child of Holocaust survivors, I decided to sort of say nothing. And I qualified, and we had our two children, and we had wonderful 7 years, and we made a great life. She was a musician, and
mm,
we used to have lots of live classical music
mm,
in the house. It was a wonderful life. And then the MS struck again, and it turned out to be the worst kind of MS, not
mm,
one of those that took you 20 or 30 years to get sick. She died within 3 years, and it was
mm.
horrendous. to watch her because she became blind and paralyzed, and deaf and dumb, and of course her children were watching this,
Oh
and
boy.
despite being a doctor, there's nothing I could do to protect them
Mm,
apart from trying to be there as a loving father. And it devastated our lives. There's just this carefully nurtured life that I'd managed to build as a doctor and a social life just disintegrate.
mm. It was another example of helpless horror that you had to
Absolutely,
face.
absolutely.
Yeah, yes. But you
And
didn't make it through, and your children made it through.
well, she died, but my
Yes,
children were devastated.
yes, of course, yes.
And one of the children, the younger of the two daughters, she was one of those that froze.
Okay.
You talk about freezing in the
Please.
face of dreadfulness. She froze and she couldn't cope, with what was happening. Um,
And that,
so,
let's just talk about that for 1 minute, because I want people to know that about children. Um, Explain, Alfred, if you would, what is it that causes the child to freeze? And when a parent sees this, what is it? What is the type of thing that this child is going through?
well, doctors have learnt that they hadn't understood this as being psychological, but if you're in danger, we either fight or we run away. And it was called fight flight. And it was discovered by some scientists in 1911. But it wasn't thought of as being psychological. And one of the things that I learnt with doing psychotherapy with Holocaust survivors was that fight, flight, as well as we now know freeze, are the three reactions we have when we are traumatized. And to fight is self explanatory, you fight it. But what it actually means psychologically is you go towards it. To run, to fly, to flight, to run away, we all understand, and we know lots of people who run away from the things they're afraid of. But with children where they can't run away, I mean, this child, she was 11 years old or 10 years old, uh, couldn't run away. And she couldn't face it. It was overwhelming every time she saw this terrible thing happening and her mother
Yes.
integrating, that she froze. And froze meant that you have to do something psychological with what's going on. And there are two things. We sort of make a kind of compartment of it, which the psychoanalyst called encapsulated, or you dissociate. What is dissociate? Dissociate is that you go to a part of your mind where the terrible thing is not happening. You make a corner of your mind again, and it's called dissociation. And that part of you that's in there separates yourself from what's going on in the rest of things. And
Right.
you can't remember these experiences. It basically stops you getting access to it. It's not that you can't remember it, you haven't got access to the memory. It separates you from the memory. So the memory is still there, but it's buried like under a carpet or in a corner of your mind or in a drawer, as you might say. Is that?
Yeah, so in other words, did she, with your help or with someone else's help, eventually integrate that very painful memory of her
Yeah.
mom?
Well, I have to say I've been truly blessed with my children. I think they're my greatest blessing. And my older daughter's become an art teacher, very creative, and as well as a musician.
Oh, yeah, just like her mother.
And
Yeah.
this exactly. So she's followed in her mother's footsteps and her mother's values. But the younger one has become a social worker, which her mother also was,
Oh,
looking
yes.
after children. But she cannot remember all of these terrible things that happened during her childhood. She can't have access to it. And even now that she's nearly approaching 50, she's still having psychotherapy, but trauma specialized therapy, in which they use a technique called EMDR,
Yes.
movement desensitization.
Okay.
Uh, and now the memories are coming back, and she was able to come with me to Poland. with three of her other siblings or half siblings, um, and to be able to cope with it,
Mm.
which is really shows progress.
Yes, she's on that road to recovery. Let me ask you something else others may benefit from. You describe powerlessness versus the psychic guardian function. Tell us what this psychic guardian function is and how it does reduce the powerlessness.
Well, let me simply explain. Everybody who's had children or had siblings, you can remember them as younger siblings, when they become toddlers, or rather before they become toddlers, when a baby starts to crawl, the first thing it goes for is stairs, if there are such things.
Yeah,
It goes into rooms where it shouldn't do, like the kitchen where there are hot stoves, or it goes for hot mugs of coffee on a low coffee table,
right.
sharp edges. So the first thing good parents do is they teach their little ones about the dangers in life that they have to learn to cope with as they're discovering, because they're exploring life. They're learning, they put things into their mouth as babies to see what they feel like. I thought this was just a matter of being good parents, but the more I realized it, the more I understood about physical illness and the way the body works, the more I realized that this is something we all do, but it is a psychological process that we hand over. We teach our children what we've learned about coping with the dangers of life, and then they add to that what they learn through their own experience. And that because I'm a clinician and I deal with clinicians, doctors, and psychotherapists, we talk about trauma, but really what the most important thing is is mortality. The one certainty after life, after you're born, is you're going to die. And the body is geared up. It has so many systems, psychological as well as physical, that are there to look out for dangers. How do we deal with dangers? So the guardian function is a survival focused mental processing and development. And I do believe from my experience with all my patients, ordinary patients as well as uh, trauma patients, that the psychic guardian function is the executive function. It's what controls everything around our mind. It gives us our priorities.
And it's an internalization of the parent in some ways.
So I'll say it again. The parents teach you all they know about survival. They have learnt, both as children, which carried on from they were taught as children, and the group analysts call this the foundation matrix. And then the children learn also from their own experience through exploration,
Mm, mm,
hurting, having falls. Because we have to learn about the dangers in your actual life.
yes,
In
yeah.
civilized life with traffic, you have to learn to cross roads. But if you live in the jungle, if you're an indigenous minority, you have to learn how to hunt, what animals might hunt for you. You
Mhm.
have to learn about the dangers that are exist in your world. And that's called the psychic guardian function. And
Okay.
I'm happy to say that a number of my colleagues from around the world are using it already
Yeah.
to help with their understanding.
S- So let's add to that, because now we're talking in a way about resilience in the face of trauma and post-trauma. You use the term reparative efforts. Um, and what do you see in terms of when someone has faced horrific trauma, the loss of a loved one, a missing loved one that is simply not someone they can even bring home and bury. Um, w- how does a person cope with this? How does a person deal with unspeakable trauma like that?
Well, it comes logically from what I've just said. They
Mhm.
will use the things invariably what that their parents use. And if their parents didn't know how to deal with traumas and the ups and downs of life, they will get depressed. They might use alcohol and other addictive things in order to deal with the pain of life because they didn't find other less well, better, more successful ways of dealing with life and the ups and downs of life.
Okay, Alfred, I apologize. I'm just gonna stop us here because I see I've got the sign to take a break. So,
Okay, we'll
um,
come back to that again.
for our listeners, I want you to know you've been listening to Psych Up Live. We are so fortunate with Dr. Alfred Garland, um, a child Holocaust survivor who over the years has worked as a general practitioner, a psychiatrist, a group leader. His book is Holocaust Trauma and Psychic Deformation, Psychoanalytic Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You've been listening to Psych Up Live, and we're talking with Dr. Alfred Garland, a child Holocaust survivor who has spent years doing work, was the co-founder of the Adult Survivors and Child Survivors Association of Great Britain. And we're really getting a perspective of being up close and personal to the horrific happening, to being a child in the concentration camps, to having sat with countless survivors over all these years, writing about this topic, reaching out to help children, adults. And so we were talking about, Alfred, reparative efforts, something that we can invite other families who are suffering from other types of horrendous events that may make sense to them, that might help them.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yes, let's talk a little bit about family reparative efforts after the
Okay,
unthinkable has happened.
thank you. I just noticed that you keep calling me Alfred Garland, and it's Garwood.
Garwood.
Wood.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you for correcting me. Yes.
Um, well, one of the things that my parents did, which was they found enormously healing, was because there were no graves and there was nowhere they could go and say sort of commemorative prayers, like you might go to a grave and of your mother or your grandmother and say a prayer or take flowers, because these didn't exist. My father was very creative, and he went to the first Holocaust museum before Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. It was called the Chamber of the Holocaust, and he had a plaque put up with their names. And he used to go to Israel every year, and he would say the Kaddish, prepare the sorry the Kaddish, the prayer for the your loved ones, your close relatives that had died.
Hmm.
Um, One of the other things he did, which was not reparative, was he buried photographs of all of our family in
Mm.
a box in a corner and never said a word again until when my wife died. I went to meet other survivors, and I said to him, if I meet someone who might be a family survivor, and they asked me, well, where do you come from? What was the name of your relatives? What was their business they're in? I said, I haven't got a clue.
Mm.
And they could be a relative, we could miss them. And he came and he brought out this biscuit tin full of these photographs of his dead family. So you can be reparative, you can be adaptive, or you can be badly adaptive, maladaptive, and do the wrong thing at the same time.
Yes.
But that was running away. When he went to Israel, he was running towards things. And when he was with the photographs, he was running away. So
Hmm.
the other thing is we all try to rebuild. In Belsen concentration camp, the year after it was liberated, 1,000 babies were born.
Mm.
Uh, and that's because there were so many deaths of children. So many people had lost their family. They had virtually nobody. Uh, People turned to be creative, to bring new life into the world.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's beautiful, but also sometimes it was disastrous because people were so damaged,
Ah.
trauma, they didn't know how to look after children.
Oh, okay.
So it was a very complicated thing. I try to rebuild a new life away from trauma, a healthy life full of music and culture and friends. And unfortunately, sometimes life gets in the way, and and it all disappeared. Sorry, go on.
So on the same vein, in terms of how people heal, we were talking at the break about groups that come together of survivors and how that makes a difference in going forward. Why do groups of that type
Yeah.
make a difference?
Well, when we first arrived in London, we were the only entire nuclear family of Polish Jewish survivors.
Oh.
And as such, we acted as a magnet to all of these Polish Holocaust survivors who used to come and used to smell my mother's uh, soup full of garlic. And they would talk about their terrible experiences. And when I was bar mitzvahed, the only family I had, apart from my parents and my sister, were these survivors. I had a community of surrogate family, and I was brought up in a traumatic community. Now, none of them knew well, some of them were more creative than others, but they didn't know how to deal with their their traumas. But they sort of tried to get on with life. When my life adjustment disintegrated, I wanted to create another community for me to be a member of, because child survivors will tell you they feel different because they have no grandparents, they have no family, they can't tell you about the things or talk about the things that other
Mm.
uh, who haven't suffered these losses can talk about. And so they feel different, and so we feel better in each other's company. We have shared experience of trauma. You don't have to talk about it, but there are simply the ways we talk about everything that kind of has a it's a kind of there's a kind of melody to the way people there's a way people talk that you can tell that they have been traumatized.
We mentioned at the break, and I want listeners to know what I think, an example of what I think Dr. Garwood's saying is when you bring together a homogeneous group, and this happened very much after 9/11, let's say they were all firefighters, or um,
Yeah.
there's a sense of knowing. So when they are together in the group, there's a feeling of, I'm with my own, so that one person speaks and someone across the room says, what he said is what I feel. And I think those groups of survivors must be incredibly important.
Well, particularly because I used to be asked to take the youngest ones because I was youngest. And when I
Yeah.
told you about going back and having the memory, these kind of body memories, I used to introduce myself because other child survivors wanted to know who you were, who are you who are sitting there, in the situation of being being a group conductor. Who are you? And I would tell them this story, and immediately they would understand because they only had fragments of memories or they'd only been told. And this not knowing anything to hold on to makes you increasingly powerless. You
Yes.
can't kind of make a narrative. Therapists talk about the importance of narrative, making a kind of sense of life. It's it that that is one way of healing, to kind of create a narrative.
Yes.
Well, that's so important. What trauma victims feel when they're with each other.
Making meaning and making narrative, as you say.
Absolutely, making sense of life. But yeah, trying to make life. Well, also I think we try to make life predictable, don't we? We try to understand it, and we all want to know about sort of how you can predict when terrible things happen. We all make great efforts to try and be healthy and avoid, illnesses like cancer.
Um, Alfred, there's a story that I remember from when we met a long time ago about, you think it's your father holding you. I think you're in the camp. But as I read your material again, I think you even came across the man involved. Could you share that story with your little one, little blonde baby, someone
Yes.
holding
Okay.
you? Okay.
This is a survivor who came to my bar mitzvah, and after my father died, I was coming to a gathering of Holocaust survivors in Los Angeles, and he lived in San Diego. And I asked him, How did he meet my father? And he told the following story. He was 15 years old when he was sent from Auschwitz in his ragged pajamas, prison pajamas, to Belsen. And he said he woke up with dead men dying on either side of him. And he knew, he said, If I didn't get out of there, I would die with them. He dragged himself out of the barracks, and this was typhus, raging typhus. Now, typhus is a terrible disease that you don't understand these days because we've all got, penicillin and things. But it killed Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, as well as huge numbers in Europe before the days of antibiotics. And it's carried by lice. They eat your blood, but they pass on this infection. He came out of the barrack and he sat by the side in the sun, warming himself. And then he saw a sight that he couldn't believe. A man was standing there carrying a baby in his arm, a blonde child in his arm, and holding the hand of a little girl, and he was wearing normal clothes with a yellow star. The man called to him, saying, could he look for his family, and he would give him bread if he would do it. And he threw a piece of bread over the wire, the barbed wire, and he rushed to grab the wire, and he said that bought him another day's life. The next day he came out, he'd looked for his family, he looked for this man's family, and they couldn't find anybody, but the man still threw him another piece of bread. He saved his life, another day's life. The following day, when he came out of the cell, he looked in that part of the camp and it was empty. And he thought he must have been delirious with fever, that it was all his imagination. He got too ill to come out, and a few days later, he doesn't know how long, he heard the voices of English being spoken. British soldiers had liberated Bergen-Belsen. They started to nurse him back with careful feeding until he got some of his strength. And then amazingly he heard another British voice coming towards him, and it was his brother-in-law. His sister had gone to London to marry, and his brother-in-law had joined the British Army, and he had liberated Belsen. And he said he would take him to London to live. And he lived. They lived in the centre of the the Jewish East End of London, called a place called Black Lion Yard. And he was walking there one afternoon, and he saw a man coming towards him carrying a blonde little child, and it looked just like the man who had saved his life in Belsen. So he approached him very cautiously, not to offend him, and he said, "Excuse me, but someone who looked exactly like you saved my life in Bergen-Belsen." And the man said, "Yes, that was me." And they embraced, and they wept, and then they walked arm in arm, because he had lived just a few yards from the man's sister,
Oh my
in
goodness.
this, just literally 10 yards away. Well, I was that child, and the man was my father.
It's an unbelievable story, Alfred. And you say you stayed close enough that he came to your bar mitzvah.
Oh yes, the survivors used to use us because until they had their own families, until they married and had children, had their own families, they needed a Jewish home, a Polish Jewish home to go to where there were children.
Yes.
Because it made them feel it hadn't all completely been destroyed. So it gave them hope.
So, Alfred, you've really been helping survivors from the time you're a little one, because you were you were the little child of hope that your father was carrying, and that as these families came to visit, we think about resilience and what gives people hope. Children do that.
I think as children, we don't know what resilience we have, and we deal with problems that arise and how they come to us. Now, after one of the uh, one of the things that happened to me was that I had rickets. I was severely malnourished. Um, and I was advised, my parents were advised, because we were penniless, to go to the British, from the British Red Cross to the local Jewish charity. And when we went there to get some help, the doctor examined me and he saw that I was half the size and weight I should have been. And I had rickets, I could barely stand. And my sister was similar but didn't have rickets. And he decided he told my mother and father, I'm going to put your children into a children's home where they're going to get sun, fresh air, and good food. And you should be grateful. So there was no question of him um, challenging, my parents challenging this, of their children being taken away. And my mother was so terrified that we'd only just got a passport. She didn't want to challenge the authorities. She thought we might be sent back to Poland.
Ah,
And so my sister and I were put into a children's home where I didn't speak English. I only spoke Polish and Yiddish. And they separated the boys from the girls. That first day when they arrived, the first thing they did, they stripped us naked and put us into a shower. Well, of course, I knew what that meant,
ah,
and I
mm,
was terrified. Then they put us into a bed in a big dormitory, a big metal bed, which I'd never seen anything the like of it. And of course, being a child and being taken away from my mother, I did what all children do when they're upset. I wet myself.
yes, yeah.
This was a terrible crime.
Oh,
And the next morning, I had to stand in front of the whole of the children's home on a chair,
it was a nightmare.
and I was deprived of having any food
Oh my God.
as a punishment. That carried on, and as I carried, understandably, because it carried on, I carried on wetting myself. And they eventually moved my bed out into the corridor in one of the coldest winters that they'd seen in England for a
This is a
century.
brutal thing.
So
Yes.
I ended up having frostbite as well as my rickets getting worse, losing weight, and of course I was severely traumatized. When my father saw me, the parents were allowed to visit once a month, once a month, and I'm 3 years old, remember.
Mm,
And the only person I could speak to was my sister, and they separated us most of the time. So my father saw us limping. He took off. I can feel his hands on my feet as I speak, and he took off my shoes and he saw the frostbite. He couldn't believe, that I had suffered
ah,
this way. And when we then, the matron in the place had threatened us that if we told anything about what's going on to our parents, they would get into trouble and we would get into trouble. But we just poured it all out, and he confronted the matron, and then he came back a few days later and took us home. So
what a horror.
I can't remember the journey because I'm sure I must have just slept on his shoulder the whole time. But then when I arrived, I remember arriving home that first night, and and the house was full of Holocaust survivors as usual, and in this tiny little bed in a cupboard, basically that my sister and I both slept in. The next morning, when I went to speak to my mother had, because after all of her family had been murdered, taken away from her, when they took her children, she had a psychotic breakdown, and uh, she just stared. When I spoke to her, I could still see her now, staring into space, and
Mm,
she was hearing voices. And now I know that what it meant,
yes,
she
yeah,
didn't respond, and she was somewhere. So one of those things.
yeah.
All children, I blamed myself for not being good enough somehow, creating that situation. My mother was ill. Maybe I'd upset her, and I promised to be good. And I then sort of just clung to
Mm,
her. I became one of those clinging children that was terrified of any separation.
for good reason. It's amazing the resilience you and your sister had, as well as your parents, that to
I
come
have to
together.
say that my sister was an absolute blessing. And the sad thing is that my sister suffered the worst of all of us because she was older than me, so she understood what was going on.
Yes,
She
yeah.
couldn't avoid it. because she was so young.
You
So
know,
she,
you're an inspiration, um, Alfred, because you're really taking us through an entire lifetime in which you have both had the resilience to keep on going, the same little blonde boy who keeps on going and for good reason was awarded, the Medal of Honor, because you've never stopped translating suffering into understanding that you have passed forward to others. It's remarkable. I mean, it's remarkable that through all this, there was resilience and brilliance.
well, as a child, I felt different from other people, and I was trying to make sense of this terrible world that I lived in, going from one trauma to another. And what I saw around me in England, particularly, was that my parents were filled with hate, which is entirely understandable. You know, their loved ones had been murdered by the Nazis. They hated the Nazis. But what I also saw was how they were also consumed by this hate. It damaged them and and all of those that were so full of hate. And I was very determined not to fall into that trap and to try and have different ways. So that's when I try to bring myself up and try to carry on uh, looking at ways to understand what's going on and how to heal these terrible wounds. Because everyone in London, they've been through the Blitz, people had come back from the war, they've been traumatized. So many of them had PTSD that we know now exists. And so I became very determined to find some to make use of this miraculous life that I had been blessed with and to try and become a healer. Now, I started when my life fell apart to find a survivor community, and then I discovered these gatherings of child survivors where I learnt to understand trauma far better than all of the textbooks. They
Yes,
didn't really
yes,
help.
I'm sure. We're almost out of time. I keep thinking that you were the recipient of the member of the British Empire, that medal, and it really does fit for the man that you are and all the people that you've touched. I wonder what take-home message, um, Dr. Garwood, would you pass on to our listeners who have had all different kinds of trauma, some of the same, some of the similar to you?
What I would say is that dis- many people I've met have had very difficult childhood, and I have learned that despite a really difficult childhood and the terrible problems of having trauma transmitted from parents, by choosing to do healing things with your life, by making a choice of becoming a healer, it helped me to overcome my own traumas, and that I've now had a rich and a fulfilling life, and I now can feel that I've been truly blessed.
Mhm. We've been truly blessed to know you and to hear you today. I want our listeners to know that you can hear this show and any prior show as a podcast on my host site, my website, and the podcast apps of iTunes, Stitcher, etc. If you would like to order his wonderful book, Holocaust Trauma and Psychic Deformation, it's available on Amazon. It's Holocaust Trauma and Psychic Deformation, Psychoanalytic Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. I want to thank you one more time, Dr. Alfred Garwood, for coming on and for sharing. What you've shared was so powerful. I don't think any of us will forget it. And congratulations and thank you for all the work you've done for so many.
And thank you.
Okay. So until next week, to my listeners, I say, please be safe, thanks, and be